beat me to the recording.
You should be able to do it on your own, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, right.
It's just sometimes it doesn't allow, it doesn't save on my side, maybe bothering you to send me back. Oh, some familiar faces. Yay, nice. Good afternoon, everyone. How is everyone doing? Ooh, TGI Friday. I know, I can't believe we're already midway into fall semester. It is my distinct pleasure as a director of the Wegland Endowed Chair for Multicultural Studies to welcome you to our 4th event this semester. And we are very thrilled to have one of our prominent scholars in our college and in the history department to speak about the Cold War 2.0. Just a little bit about Dr. Wang. Zoyu Wang and I go way back. Actually, I met him when he started. He started a year after I did in 1999. And from them, I've always been impressed with his prolific nature in terms of his publications, but also his public scholarship that he does. He gives, numerous presentations, and also he was a fellow at Harvey Mudd University. His expertise is on Chinese American scientists and Asian American transnational scientists as well. And I've had the luxury and privilege of working with him on different types of projects. Dr. Wang is also an advisory member of the Wegland Endowment. And so we are thrilled. I think his topic is timely. I'm hoping that we'll get a better sense of what Cold War 2.0 means today. And with that, I'd like to welcome you to the Wegland event and welcome Dr. Zoyu Wang.
Thank you, Mary. I hope everybody can hear me well. Thanks for the introduction, and it's my pleasure to speak in this series that I was involved in organizing. And it is a timely topic, as I think US-China relations has figured prominently in the current presidential election. But the tension has been going on for quite a while and has affected not only Chinese Americans, but Asian Americans in general. And I will explore a little bit more in depth about my own specialty, which is history of science, as I'm actually writing a book on the history of Chinese American scientists. So welcome to all, and welcome your questions. And I think you can send your questions through the chat, and I'll try to speak for maybe 30 minutes or so, and then should have time for discussion. I think Mary will moderate the discussion, both via live questions and also through the chat. So I'm going to set my own timer to 30 minutes to remind myself to stop. So, all right, so if it's okay with everybody, I'm going to go do the share screen. So I prepared some slides. I maybe may have over-prepared, but we will take a look to guide me through some of the topics I want to address. All right, so the kind of main theme for my talk today is how US-China relations really affected Chinese Americans and Asian Americans in general. And my focus, as I said, will be Chinese American scientists. And I'll be looking at the kind of experience of Chinese Americans through a historical study of Chinese American scientists. So my main argument up front is that Chinese American scientists have made crucial contributions to American science, technology, and medicine. I guess in today's COVID-19 pandemic, I think that needs to be emphasized especially. But they have also suffered, as I'll try to explain, periodically, politically, and racially influenced persecutions in the US. So I'll talk about how, as Mary mentioned, that many people see the coming of US-China Cold War and also the rising attacks on Chinese Americans or Asian Americans during the COVID-19 pandemic. And also, as some of you may have read in the news, that an increasing number of Chinese American scientists who work in the US research institutions and academic institutions have come under increased scrutiny, including arrest of a number of them for on various charges. So finally, I'll try to draw some lessons that we can draw from history. Okay. So speak of Cold War 2.0, many scholars question whether that's an appropriate label to apply to US-China relations, because as historians, we very much are aware that history doesn't repeat itself, although some patterns will reappear, but no two historical events are the same. So we should be on guard against simplistic analogizing. But at least in my own studies, I have studied the US-Soviet Cold War. I wrote my first book on the American science policy during the Cold War, titled In Sputnik's Shadow. And Sputnik was the name of the Soviet satellite that was launched in 1957. It led to the US president's appointing a President's Science Advisory Committee. That's the history that I wrote in that book. So I've studied that, original Cold War, and I, of course, have been observing the increasing tension between the US and China today. And so I've been making comparisons. So I see some similarities and a lot of differences as well. So I will touch on some of that. But the overall general developments in recent years, we can point to the heightened or tightened Communist Party control in China, US-China trade frictions, of course, the current COVID-19 pandemic that has really also affected US-China relations. And another factor that has changed or affected US-China relations is the current US presidential election. I think there was a report not too long ago where President Trump and the Republican Party made a decision some month ago to make China, or blaming China as a central strategy in the president's re-election campaign. So all those factors have come into shaping up the US-China relations that we see today. And one of the most recent, quite a comprehensive statements made by a US official is actually took place on July 23rd this year by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo at Nixon Library, not too far from our Capitol campus. And so there's several quotes from that speech that are striking that remind some people of the new Cold War, so to speak. So one of the quotes was that he said, "The kind of engagement we have been pursuing since President Nixon made the historical trip to China in 1972 has not brought the kind of change inside of China that President Nixon had hoped to induce." And he said, in following up, so he called on the securing our freedoms from the Chinese Communist Party. He's not talking about China, is singling out the Chinese Communist Party, is the mission of our time. And he will go on actually to talk about, making some explicit comparisons actually with the US-Soviet relations during the Cold War. So he mentioned that President Reagan said that he dealt with the Soviet Union on the basis of trust but verify. And then Secretary Pompeo said, when it comes to the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, I say we must distrust and verify. So it sounds like the relationship is even more detrimental than the Cold War case. And then he also went on to say the USSR, the Soviet Union, was closed off from the free world. But in contrast, communist China is already within our borders. And he had given examples of how he said the the Chinese government has sent students, scholars, scientists, and propagandists into our universities, into even our PTAs. And so the implication, I think, is often kind of reflected very negatively on Chinese Americans and Asian Americans in general. I mean, he did make, to his credit, Secretary Pompeo made a clear distinction between the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese people. But I think that he did not make clear the distinction between the Chinese agents or people who have violated American laws, who have come from China, from the vast majority of Chinese Americans and Asian Americans who have been law-abiding American citizens. I think that message needs to be emphasized again and again whenever you try to paint a picture of Chinese sending agents within our borders. And indeed, I think that during this COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen a mounting and worsening attacks on Chinese Americans and Asian Americans in general. A recent study by a nonprofit organization sponsored in part by our sister campus at San Francisco, by its Asian American Studies Department, found that 1 of 4 young Asian Americans have personally experienced anti-Asian hate crimes during the COVID-19 pandemic. And they have observed at least about 2,500 reported cases of anti-Asian crimes. And of course, we all know that such cases are vastly underreported. And also, as many of you who have taken classes in Asian American studies or Chinese American history will know that there was the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was renewed periodically all the way from 1882 to 1943. And you may have also heard of the case of Vincent Chen's murder in 1982 by 2 whites in Detroit who mistook him as a Japanese because those 2 whites had been affected by the Japanese automobile import into the US. And recently we have another case, a Japanese jazz pianist who lived in New York, Taka Ono, who was attacked by a group of teenagers actually, and he heard them calling him a Chinese, and at least he felt that the American politicians' words that cast Chinese people in the negative light may have been at least part of the cause for his attack in this incident. And coming closer to the Chinese American scientists, the US government has launched a China initiative from November 2018. And from a recent speech by the FBI director, Christopher Wray, that the government apparently has about 1,000 active cases, 1,000 investigations of Chinese American scientists, most of them scientists and medical researchers in the US, mostly in universities, who are being investigated, and also some non-Chinese scientists, American scientists who have been investigated as well. And they do have a number of cases where either the accused have pled guilty or charges have been brought against them. But there are also other cases where the reason for the starting investigation did not pan out. So instead, those people were charged or convicted of tax fraud and things like that. And some at least have felt that, have expressed the concerns over racial profiling in such investigations. And as a historian, I have studied the cases of Chinese American scientists who have been affected by US-China relations or been affected by national security restrictions. So recently a case involving Harry Shin. This is actually, I did not dig up this case. It was actually found out by a journalist who wrote a piece, and she kind of interviewed me on this for my knowledge of the historical background. But so she filed the FBI a FOIA request, Freedom of Information request to the FBI for formerly classified documents related to the FBI's program of surveillance on Chinese American scientists in the 1960s and 1970s. And so she found this case of Harry Shin, who actually, fled from the communist China. He said he was anti-communist, was a patriotic American, but his mother was living in China, very elderly, and was sick. So he went back to China in 1973 after President Nixon's trip reopened the U.S.-China relations. And so he went to see his mother. But once he came back to U.S., he was interviewed by the FBI and other national security agents. He did work in a defense firm, and fairly quickly afterwards, he was laid off and couldn't find another job in his field. And he did not even know the real cause for his difficulties until Vincent, this reporter, found the FBI files that they simply thought that he represent a security risk, and he was part of that massive surveillance program on Chinese American scientists. And more recently, some of you may have heard of the case of Wen-Ho Lee, who was a computer scientist, a Chinese American scientist who actually came from Taiwan. He worked in Los Alamos, working on nuclear weapons, and he was charged with like more than 50 counts of serious charges, including nuclear espionage. And he was threatened with the death penalty in the interviews with US government agents before the trial. He was put under horrendous pre-trial detention conditions, not only in handcuffs, but ankle shackles, and not allowed to have free consultation with outside people, like including his very limited contact with outside, with a solitary confinement for several months. And but finally, the government case against him collapsed. All that 50-some charges were dropped, except for one minor charge of mishandling technical secrets. He said he downloaded computer files from the lab computer to unclassified computer. He said that the government, the lab updated its software system. So whenever it happens, he lost information for his work. He said everybody did that. But anyway, so, and he said there were other scientists, even higher ranking officials, who did things similar to what he did, but never were charged. So he felt that this was a case of racial profiling. And he was released and just charged and pled guilty to that one count. And the penalty was for the days he had already served in detention. And the presiding judge actually issued an apology on the day that he was released for demeaning unnecessary punitive pre-trial detention. And that was a case, I think, that triggered activism on the part of many Chinese American and Asian American activists in '99 and 2000. And most recent two cases involves a physicist, Xiaoxin and Shen from Temple University, and a meteorologist, Chen. She was arrested by the FBI in pre-dawn hours in front of his family. His wife was a physicist and two college daughters, and with guns drawn on him. And so he was arrested, detained, but then the charge against him eventually collapsed. And again, this time just completely without any kind of clear explanation. It turned out that he was accused of transferring high-tech classified technology involving high-temperature superconductivity to Chinese scientists. It turned out the technology he was accused of transferring was not the technology that he actually did share with the scientists. It was unclassified. He actually invented that technology himself, and so the case collapsed, but his career was damaged, and he lost his chairmanship of the physics department at Temple University. And since then he has tried to get to the government to clarify the rules of international scientific exchange, to really give back his reputation. And the American Physics Society has praised his activism on behalf of international scientific exchange and gave him the Sakharov Award last year. And Chen, again, was accused of sharing information with Chinese colleagues. And again, the case collapsed, but he was fired from his government position, and he was never given back his position. She was never given back to her position, even though the case against her was dropped. And she has been fighting against that loss of position ever since then. And then I'd like to give, again, drawing from my own research on Chinese American scientists, the history of Chinese American scientists, give you some overview of that history. So I have some general comments on Chinese American scientists. We usually hear of Chinese American scientists, or Chinese Americans, or Asian Americans in general, by talking about how many contributions we have made to the United States. But I want to emphasize first that we have rights not because of our contributions, but because we are human beings, we are American citizens. As human beings, all Chinese American scientists should have human rights. As Americans, we should have our civil rights and constitutional rights. And also, as some of the cases I've mentioned earlier illustrate, Asian Americans have a shared history, experience, and sense of a community. And so Chinese American scientists are part of the Asian Americans community. They're also part of the American scientific community. And just like all Chinese Americans, all Asian Americans actually, they have been influenced by US-China relations. And that's the case no matter what your political orientations. As I said, that Chinese scientist Shen, he was anti-communist, but still he was accused of being a security risk and lost his jobs. And Wen Haoli was from Taiwan, and he still lost his position. Some other general characteristic of Chinese American scientists, there's a great diversity, the multi-generations of Chinese American scientists. They have come from all over the world, from mainland China, from Taiwan, Hong Kong, and other parts of the world. Some of them, many of them are immigrants, different generations of immigrants, but some of them are American-born. For example, Stephen Chu, the physicist who won Nobel Prize in the 1990s and who served as President Obama's first Secretary of Energy, he was native-born. He was born to immigrants' parents from China. And they're interdisciplinary. They have won Nobel Prize in physics, chemistry, and they work in different fields, engineering, and especially medicine, as I'll illustrate some of them. And they work in academia, in industry, and government. And speaking of industry, many Chinese American scientists worked as engineers in the aerospace industry in Southern California, made great contributions to the space program. And another interesting observation from my study is that when I look at US-China relations in terms of a scientific and educational exchanges, it's actually often the US government that insists on the Chinese government sending Chinese students to the United States. Now, I'll give you some examples. And often for many years, especially since President Nixon's trip to China in '72, it has been bipartisan consensus to work on the relationship to especially encourage Chinese Americans and Chinese American scientists in particular to help to engage in US-China scientific exchange for mutual benefits for improved relations. In terms of the timeline, we can look at from about 1900 to 1949, which in history of China is called the Republican period. That's a distinctive period. And then when the Communist Party took over mainland in 1949, when Mao Zedong was the Chinese leader from 49 to 1976. So that's what we might call the Mao era. And then after a short transition, when we get to 1978, all the way probably to the present, in China it's called the Reform era. And in terms of US-China relations, it's when US-China re-established diplomatic relations. So if we go back to the earliest period, one of the most significant sources of Chinese-American scientists early in the 20th century were those so-called Boxer Fellows. They were called Boxer Fellows because they draw funds from the money that the Chinese government had to pay the US in the early 20th century because there was uprising in China. It's called the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. And they attacked missionaries and foreign embassies. And so the US and other countries, actually foreign countries, sent troops to China to put down the uprising and force the Chinese government to pay a huge amount of indemnity punishment funds to the US and other foreign countries. And it turned out the payment to the US was more than the actual costs. So that extra cost should have been, given back to China. But the US said, we're going to give back that extra payment on the condition that China used the money to send students to the US. And therefore, was born the Boxer Fellowship Program. So every year they send about 100 Chinese students to the United States. Overall, more than 1,000 of the China's best were sent over to the US. Most of them went back to China after their studies, but a number of them have stayed in the US and became leaders in American science and education. And indeed, a number of that Boxer Fellows actually founded the Science Society of China at Cornell University in 1914. That played a big part in the development of science in China. So it's, the point is that such exchange, the students who came from China and studied in the US really brought mutual benefits to US and China. So this is the 1930s, a picture of a group of Boxer Fellows, including H.S. Chen, the well-known Chinese aerospace scientist who got his PhD from Caltech and became a very important aerospace scientist in the US. And in 1955, he, out of that Cold War McCarthy era politics, he went back to China and really became a leader of the Chinese space program. So 1949 was a turning point in the history of Chinese American scientists. There were about 5,000 Chinese students, most of them studying science and engineering. So now the communists took over mainland China, so they had to make a choice. And the US government actually encouraged and even demanded that they stay in the US instead of going back to China. But eventually, about 1,300 of them did go back to China in the 1950s. Some because they had families, spouses, children, but still left behind in China. Some did have connection with the Chinese Communist Party, some were just purely patriotic. But a majority, about 4,000 of that group actually stayed in the US, became very prominent, including T.D. Lee and Shen Yang, who won the Nobel Prize in 1957 in physics, and also C.S. Wu, the woman Chinese American physicist who actually led an experiment to prove Lee and Yang's theory, but unfortunately she didn't share the Nobel Prize, but she became a very prominent leader in American physics as well. And then of course, the Chinese American scientific community was formed, became active after Nixon's trip to China in 1972 in bringing Chinese American science and education sectors together. And one of their most important achievements was to reopen the doors for Chinese students, the new generation, my generation in a way. I came to the US in 1986 to come to study in the US after 1978. So this is a picture of Shen Yang and T.D. Lee, together with other Nobel Prize winners in the world. And this is a picture of President Nixon going to China to this meeting with Premier Zhou Enlai. And again, the history of how Chinese students and the scientists came to the US after his trip was that while in China, President Nixon signed a US-China communique with Premier Zhou Enlai, in which science and technology were singled out as the sectors that US-China will work to improve relations. And then in 1978, Frank Press, who served as President Carter's science advisor, was in Beijing meeting with Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping one day, and they talk about how China was going to send 5,000 Chinese students to the US. You know, this is for the first time after a quarter century of being close to each other. And Deng insists that Frank Press call President Carter to make sure that number was okay with President Carter. So Press called Carter, and it turned out it was the middle of the night. President Carter had already gone to sleep. So he was woken up. And so he said, Frank, what happened? Is there a disaster in the world? You're waking me up? Frank Press says, no, I'm with Mr. Deng Xiaoping, and he wants to make sure it's okay for China to send 5,000 students to the US. And President Carter apparently said, you know, tell him to send 100,000. That is, he's very enthusiastic. And of course, indeed, 5 years later, China sent 100,000 students to the US. And when President Carter was reminiscing about this episode in 2013, he found that there were already 235. And he said, you know, he's very proud of that achievement. And he said it helped to break down the mutual barriers. And he said it was important for future world leaders to become familiar with each other. And for my own study, I found that not only did Chinese American scientists help to help improve mutual cultural understanding and scientific understanding, but also some of them actually help to play the part of diplomats in improving US-China relations. The specific example of what I'm talking about is T.D. Lee, the Nobel Prize laureate I mentioned earlier. I found out in the 1980s, he helped to bring American scientists led by Wolfgang Panofsky, the American scientist in the middle here from Stanford. And oh, time is up. And also the Chinese scientist, in this case, Zhu Guangya, who was leader of the Chinese atomic bomb project, he knew them both very well. And so Panofsky tried to get in touch with Zhu Guangya to get Chinese scientists involved in a discussion on nuclear arms control with American scientists, but he didn't have any way of getting directly in touch with Zhu Guangya. So it's actually T.D. Lee who helped to bring them together and thus helped to initiate the nuclear arms control discussion between American and Chinese scientists. And recently, we also prepared a talk for the Chinese American Museum sponsored lecture series. I did a search on Google on Chinese American scientists. It's interesting that this 7 scientists came up on the top. So just very briefly, David Ho, some of you may know, he helped develop the cocktail treatment of AIDS patients. Really did contribute to saving numerous lives from the AIDS pandemic. And also he's now working on the COVID-19 vaccine and treatment, working with a team that included Chinese and Asian American scientists, and also working with the scientists in China as part of international scientific exchange. And the other side is Roger Chen, C.S. Wu, Changlin Tian, who was the first Chinese American, Asian American to head a major US research university in UC Berkeley, and S.S. Chen, one of the most prominent mathematicians in the world, and two other life scientists. So it's interesting that the life scientists came to prominence in this kind of measure from Google search. It probably shows that, as we live through a major medical crisis, our attention are drawn to the medical sciences. Okay, so let me wrap up with some general observations. One is that, as I mentioned, the Chinese American scientists students have been encouraged by the US government to come to study in the US, sometimes to stay in the US, and often also to engage in scientific and educational exchange and collaboration with colleagues in China for both improved relations, but also for mutual benefits. They have made breakthrough discoveries for American science, technology, and medicine, and also importantly, for those who are taking Dr. Danico's class on Asian American studies, they have, I think, broken the so-called model minority myth, not just behaving as good professionals, but also have engaged in political activism to fight for the rights of Asian Americans, to fight for affirmative action. For example, Changlin Tian, when he was chancellor of UC Berkeley, fought fiercely for for the affirmative actions programs for every American. They have also promoted what I summarize as Americanization of international science, that's spreading American influence in the world, but also internationalization of American science itself to attract more brilliant immigrants, including students, to the US, which have helped to keep American science and technology and medicine at the cutting edge in the world. So finally, here are some of the lessons I draw from my historical studies for today. One is that, as I mentioned, I think, as Chinese Americans, as Asian Americans, as Chinese or Asian American scientists, they should be recognized for their contributions, but they should also be recognized for their inherent right, inalienable rights guaranteed by the US Constitution, by the Human Rights Conventions, right? So that's something we should not lose sight. And second is that international scientific collaborations, including collaborations with Chinese scientists, are crucial, not only for solving the COVID-19 pandemic we're facing, but also other global problems for mutual benefits, for benefits of Chinese people, American people, and people in the world, and other global problems like climate change and the nuclear arms problems, all right? And then finally, also, that, of course, every one of us Chinese American scientists, Asian American scientists should follow American laws and rules and regulations, try to maintain transparency in any kind of international scientific or educational exchange. But we should also be on guard to protect our rights and also to remind law enforcement personnel or employers to avoid racial profiling, to avoid discrimination based on national origins, which is explicitly prohibited by the US 1964 Civil Rights Act. All right, so I'm going to stop there and thank you for your attention, and I will stop sharing and come back here to hopefully with some questions we can discuss. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Soyu. I think one of the, and as I'm speaking, for those of you who have questions or have comments, feel free to use the chat or raise your hand emoji, and we'll be more than happy to have the conversation with you. But as I was listening to you, this is almost like a love-hate relationship with China. There is one area when you think about the US narrative and the landscape that everything is made in China. When you think about the things that we buy, the things that we consume, in many ways, Panda Express is American food, right? Because it's not in China. And so we have this relationship with part of Chinese culture, or what it means to be Chinese, cheap products and things that we really adore and crave. but concurrently, there is this inherent fear and hatred toward Chinese that has, as I think you spoke very eloquently, that's fueled by the depiction of Chinese scientists or Chinese people in particular personnels that are seen as foreigners, as spies, or a threat. And it is this juxtaposition of Chinese American communities and even international scholars who may never achieve citizenships. I would argue, I think you would too, that whether you're American or not, everyone has their human rights, right? It doesn't matter if you're an immigrant, if you're undocumented, everyone has human rights. And we do have folks from Asia who are also undocumented. But the reality though for Chinese, I think as you kind of chronicle through your historical landscape, is that we are never truly trusted, right? I'm not Chinese, but we as an Asian Americans are not truly trusted. And I think when you talked about Vincent Chen and the Japanese artists and other, the reality is when I immigrated from Korea, people told me I was Chinese. Even when I told them I wasn't, they're like, you're Chinese. And it's really not making us visible as people, I think as you point out, but also in terms of the contributions that we make, but also, as you point out, breaking the mold of the model minority by making waves and demanding justice, right? Demanding representation, demanding equity. And so how do we, in this Cold War 2.0, right? How do we as citizens or residents or, people living in California and around, how do we respond to that? Because as you pointed out with COVID, there has been a rise, and Russell Jung from San Francisco State has chronicled it beautifully. There's been a rise, sadly, of anti-Asian hate crimes. There has been a rise of violence against Asian Americans and targeting of elderly and young people across the board. And Asian Americans have been in this nation and this continent for as long as many of the original colonizers and settlers have. So how do we respond to this in a way that is not necessarily defensive, but in terms of advocating and promoting? I mean, what are some of your recommendations? What can we learn from history, that we can practice today in light of all the horror that's happening?
Right. Mary, thank you. Yeah, that's important question. It's a difficult question. That we're living through right now. Every situation is different, but some of the principles we live by remain the same. And looking at the background from your Zoom window, I see the Weglands, right? I think they serve as a model for us to just keep on fighting for our rights, to get involved in the community, to use the legal grounds that we have to assert our right, defend our rights. I think that's, as citizens or as non-citizens, as immigrants, as green card holders, we all should have certain levels of right. I think the Supreme Court even has ruled, people who live in the US, not just citizens, every one of us should have some legal protection from arbitrary encroachment of our rights. So I think that it's incumbent on all of us to get involved. And the most pressing way, the issue or the most concrete way we can get involved is by voting in a couple of weeks, right? That's to exercise, those of us who are eligible to vote should exercise that political right.
Yeah, and I think, what's really interesting with the voting and the current administration's flaming of really anti-Chinese sentiments every moment, from calling this the China virus or the Chinese virus, and from, not unapologetically, pitting communities against each is alarming. And many folks will say, well, that's just one person, but this one person happens to be the president of this nation,
right?
Where you have someone like Jimmy Carter, applauding the fact that we're having great minds and great people coming in, or offering other communities. We have a lot of mainland Chinese who are undocumented, who are struggling, but giving people opportunities. I appreciate you saying that, get out there and vote, because I think that is so critical. But how about if you cannot vote? How about if you're underage or you don't have the citizenship? What are some ways that we could, debunk this model minority stereotype? Because when people think scientists are thinking, oh, they've already made it. How do we talk to the really conservative Chinese out there who are really against Prop 16 right now, which is to bring back affirmative action? What are some lessons learned that you could recommend from, you've done this work for so long? What can we do?
I think, there are, of course, many things we can do. One of the things I think would be valuable for, besides voting, is to educate ourselves, right? To learn the history, to know the struggle. For example, for, politically conservative Chinese Americans who seem to view the relationship between, say, Chinese Americans or Asian Americans and African Americans as one of antagonism. I think if you educate yourself, you know how the African American led civil rights struggle helped to secure the rights for all Americans, including Chinese Americans, Asian Americans, right? I think education is another powerful weapon to fight against ignorance and injustice.
No, I completely agree with you. As I was sharing with you, I'm currently in Hawaii, and I was talking to my friend as she's filling out her ballot, and she raised a really important question. How do you know what you're reading is true? Right? How do you know that, when we're talking like be educated, be informed, how do we know right now with everything that's going on? If you think about the anti-Asian sentiment and anti-Chinese sentiment that has happened since the beginning of time, has been fueled by media, back in print, back in propaganda, literature, and so forth. But now social media, it just flames it. What are ways that we could, this is one way, obviously, right? Enjoying, I applaud all of you who are able to make it today, is to come and get some information and some enlightenment and some insight. But how does one get educated, right? I think that's the challenge, right? And those of us who are in the academy, we're very lucky and very privileged to be in this position. How do we appeal? How do you recommend people talk to their families, about these things? I think I feel like, those are really tough. I don't know if you have the answers to this, Oya, but I think
I have some. Yeah. I don't necessarily have the answer, but I have some thoughts as to in what directions we might be able to move to improve our strategy in dealing with this widespread disinformation media world that we live in. And it actually goes back to my own profession, to history. Some of you, if you're taking my class, you remember me talking about this. And in history, we talk about the importance of primary sources. That is, if you make a claim, you're going to have to back up with evidence. And you can't just make a claim and let it stand as it is, as often our president often does that, right? You're going to have, as a historian, as a citizen, we need to find the source, the evidence on which your claim is based on. Right. So, for example, in order to prepare for today's talk, I actually went and read Secretary Pompeo's speech in its entirety, right, to see what he actually said. And you understand what the current administration's policy is on China. So I think that, we used to think when, again, coming back to my own background in history of science technology, when the internet first emerged in the 1990s, myself included, were we were enthusiastic about the internet as a tool of liberation, of expression, right? We thought it gave individual citizens, individual human beings the freedom to express ourselves, to communicate. But now we know the internet does have a dark side. Nation states and political forces have tried and succeeded to probably astonishing degree, succeeded in launching this kind of misinformation campaigns. And so we should be aware of that. As a citizen, it is our duty to assess the information we come across and to ask for evidence, just basic civic duties, I think.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I know we have a few minutes, so I wanted to, Kelly, I'm not sure if I wasn't able to see if we had any hands up or anything like that, but do any of you have questions or comments or just thoughts that you want to share? I know that one of our guests, was asking about Wenho Lee, and he was very happy that you brought Wenho Lee up and was on the slides as well. But do any of you have questions or thoughts that you would like to ask of Zoyu, Dr. Wang?
I believe Albert Fatal, sorry if I'm pronouncing your last name wrong, is raising their hands right now.
Okay, okay, great.
Oh, that's okay. Hi, Dr. Wang. I hope you're having a wonderful
Hi,
day.
Albert.
Of course, this is a very complicated and very important topic, particularly for the next couple of decades with the United States and China race towards a possible supremacy from one or the other. There's the technological and the economic race. Now, I read a few books recently, Ray Dalio's The Changing World Order and Kai-Fu Lee's AI Superpowers. And I have a big confusion. Perhaps you might be able to explain it to me a little bit better. It's my understanding that perhaps there are two parties in China, the Chinese Communist Party versus the People's Republic of China. My confusion may be because it appears that General Secretary Xi Jinping appears to be deeply nestled between the two parties. Can you explain if in fact these are two different parties or if they are one in the same?
Yeah, Albert, that's a good question. Again, for people who may not have studied the Chinese history, the renewed emphasis by US government officials, including Secretary Pompeo, about Chinese Communist Party may raise questions. No, this one party only in China. As I go back, went back before this year. I cannot go back this year clearly, but I have gone back to teach and give lectures in China for many summers. That there is only one party, it's the Chinese Communist Party. And part of the reform, as I mentioned, was actually under Deng Xiaoping, was to separate the party and the government so that there'll be more modernization so to take the party out of running everything. But under the current leadership of Xi Jinping, he has again reasserted the central control by the Chinese Communist Party. But the People's Republic of China, that's the name of, that's official name of the country. So it's not another political party. But Albert, you mentioned the AI, artificial intelligence. It is one of the big issues that's part of the current US-China friction as well. As you may have heard, the US government has tried to persuade European governments, for example, to not allow the Chinese firm Huawei to be part of their 5G network, or other kind of IT, including AI sector technology projects. I've thought about that too, because I've studied the history of nuclear arms race, how the threat of a nuclear war forced the US and the Soviet Union to come to nuclear arms control agreements. And I wonder whether the reliance we have today on IT in terms of infrastructure, in terms of our medical system, our power supplies, it's so critical that any threat, from any actors to kind of disrupt or destroy that will pose, a similar threat to nuclear weapons. And I hope that maybe that threat will one day force the governments of the world, including the US and Chinese governments, to come to, negotiation, to come to some kind of arms control agreements that will have certain level of understanding, because it is becoming more and more a huge problem facing us. So I know that, Albert, you have been studying this issue. I hope that you will also pay attention. And recently, when I was talking to a computer scientist about the threat that IT has posed to the world, he mentioned, besides that kind of hardware threat, he mentioned disinformation, right? As we talked earlier, as Dr. Nico mentioned earlier, that this has been, a real serious threat to American democracy, to our elections. And so that's something we need to also be on guard against. good question. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Wang. Of course, as you mentioned, this is an interest that I take very, very deeply. I am highly fascinated by what's currently occurring with China and the United States, particularly in the technological and economic world order, as they might say, in the coming decade, 2 or even 3 decades. It's very clear that China is significantly improving technology and catching up very quickly, exponentially, to the United States on a route that it will likely surpass the United States if there is no change. And of course, having 2 competing alternative economic parties can make the world a bit complicated. And I'm very grateful of your answer, and it certainly allowed me to understand this topic a little bit more. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just make another quick comment in connection with that wide perception, as you mentioned, that how everybody think that China is catching up or even surpassing the US in science and technology. In certain sense, that's true. China has made huge progress in recent years. But for scholars who study history of science technology, the picture is more nuanced in the sense that China has made huge progress in clearly manufacture, as Dr. Dika mentioned, but also in applied research in some certain technological fields. AI is one, 5G is another. But in many areas, especially in basic research, in a scientific, fundamental scientific areas recognized, for example, by the Nobel Prizes, China still lags way behind. Partly because the system you can trace back to, I don't know, maybe traditional culture or the political system that operates in China. There's not the kind of encouragement of freedom of thought, freedom of expression that is inducive or even necessary for basic scientific discoveries. And so that's why China is relatively weak in basic research. And broadly speaking, basic research is the foundation of technological innovations. And so in that sense, China, actually the government recognizes that as being its weakness. It's trying to improve in that regard. But again, without radical reforms in the political culture, it's going to be a difficult task. So the pictures, as I said, is more complex than the simple assertion that China has, surpassed the U.S. in the new technological competition.
Thank you, Albert, for that question. And our time is about up, so we have time for one more question if anyone has any. But please know that this will be uploaded to, instantly on the Facebook page for Wegland and eventually on our website. Any other last questions? And I really appreciate you all spending your Friday afternoon pauhana or happy hour time with each other. Maybe you have a glass of something next to the screen as we're listening and really learning quite a bit. I think what you said really is about the nuanced nature of the China-US relations, and that it is quite complicated, and providing some framework or narrative is very important for us to get a better holistic picture.
Right.
Folks are saying they're having tea and they're having coffee. I'm having water. Yeah, but thank you so much, Dr. Wang, and really appreciate it. I hope that we could have this continuing dialogue. Thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.
Yeah, so anyone, thanks everybody. Thanks, Mary, for hosting this. And for anyone who's interested in, if you have any further questions afterwards, you're welcome to email me. You can Google me if you can learn to spell my name right. Even if you spell it wrong, I think Google will find me. But you'll find my email address, which is zywang@cpp.edu. So you're welcome to email me to ask any further questions. But thank you. Thanks, Kelly and Kayla and Mary for hosting this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. All right. Have a great weekend, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Have a good day.